For 6 minutes, 4 human beings were completely unreachable. No radio, no telemetry, no way to scream for help. They were surrounded by plasma hotter than the surface of a volcano, falling at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, inside a capsule protected by a heat shield that had already failed once before. And the most terrifying part? What they saw through those windows during those 6 minutes, nobody on the ground could prepare them for. We're going to get to exactly what that looked like, what it felt like, and what they were thinking in those final seconds before either the shield held or everything ended. But first, quick question before we dive in. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how far this one travels. Stay with me, because the full story of those 6 minutes doesn't start on April 10th, 2026. It starts 3.5 years earlier, with a spacecraft nobody was inside and a heat shield that came back in pieces. December 2022, NASA launches Artemis 1. No crew, just the Orion spacecraft on a solo test run around the moon and back. No stakes, no astronauts, just data collection and confidence building ahead of the first crewed mission in history to go beyond low Earth orbit since 1972. The flight looked perfect. Orion circled the moon, took stunning photographs, came screaming back toward Earth, splashed down in the Pacific off Baja, California, right on schedule. Mission accomplished. Everyone smiling. Then they flipped the capsule over and looked at the bottom. The heat shield was supposed to come back evenly charred. That's what ablative shields do. They absorb heat by burning away in a slow, controlled, completely predictable way, layer by layer, like a candle burning from the outside in. Orion's shield had not done that. Pieces of the outer layer had cracked apart and blown off. Not small chips, fragments, large enough that they left a debris trail behind the spacecraft on the way down. Engineers found damage in over 100 locations across the shield's surface. Now, the astronauts, if there had been any, probably would have survived. Probably. Temperatures inside the capsule stayed in the mid-70s. The structure held. But that word probably is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. NASA launched a full investigation. Over 100 tests at facilities across the country, laser testing, hypersonic wind tunnels, arc jet facilities in California. They pulled nearly 200 material samples and shipped them to Alabama for analysis. 2 years later, in December 2024, they finally had an answer. The heat shield material wasn't porous enough. During re-entry, the material heats up and undergoes a process called pyrolysis, essentially combustion without oxygen, which generates pressurized gas inside the shield. Normally, that gas seeps outward through the outer charred layer and disappears harmlessly into the slipstream. On Artemis 1, it couldn't get out. The outer layer had sealed itself too tightly. The gas built up underneath like pressure in a sealed container. Cracks formed. And when the capsule hit peak heating, those pressurized pockets didn't vent, they exploded outward, popping chunks of the shield off like blisters bursting under pressure. And here's the part that stings. Apollo engineers had figured this exact problem out 50 years earlier. The original heat shield formula used on Apollo command modules was specifically designed to stay permeable under high heat. It worked perfectly, every single time. But the Artemis version had been quietly reformulated and nobody caught that the change had removed its ability to breathe until pieces of it were floating in the Pacific Ocean. Now here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. By the time engineers were cutting into that recovered shield and running their analysis, the Artemis 2 heat shield was already built, already attached to the spacecraft, and already waiting. Replacing it? Years of additional delay, and this program was already behind schedule by half a decade. So NASA made a decision. Fly it anyway.
The logic NASA used to justify that decision was actually reasonable, on paper. The damage on Artemis 1 had been caused by the skip re-entry profile, the technique where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, bounces back up, then plunges in again. During that bounce, the outer char layer cooled and sealed while the inner layers stayed scorching hot. Gas had nowhere to go. So their fix was to change the trajectory entirely. Instead of skipping like a stone across water, Artemis 2 would take a steeper, more direct path. Come in fast, come in continuously hot, never give the outer layer time to cool and seal itself. Keep the shield breathing from entry to splashdown. The modified trajectory, they argued, would solve the problem without touching the shield at all. Not everyone was convinced. A former astronaut named Charles Kamada, a heat shield expert who had flown on the first shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster, publicly estimated the probability of catastrophic failure at 1 in 20. 1 in 20. That sounds reassuring until you learn that NASA's own official safety threshold for crew loss during re-entry is supposed to be around 1 in 500. Commando wasn't just outside the acceptable margin, he was 25 times outside it. He said the analytical tools being used to evaluate the shield mirrored the exact same institutional failures that led to Challenger and Columbia. He said the agency hadn't fully modeled how cracks could propagate under the new trajectory. He said the decision to fly was being driven by schedule pressure, not engineering certainty. And the ghost that haunted every single one of those conversations was Columbia. February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia breaks apart during re-entry. Superheated air penetrates a breach in the thermal protection system caused by a piece of foam that struck the wing during launch 16 days earlier. Engineers had flagged it. Management had decided not to investigate further. The reasoning? It had happened before without catastrophic consequences, so it would probably be fine again. 7 crew members died. 23 years later, NASA was asking 4 astronauts to trust a heat shield that had visibly failed on its only previous flight. Reed Wiseman, the commander, told reporters he had sat in every engineering meeting, walked through all the data personally, and was satisfied. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "If we fly the new trajectory, this shield will hold." He said that, then he strapped himself in. On April 1st, 2026, the Space Launch System rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center. 4 astronauts, first crewed lunar mission in 53 years. They flew to the moon. They broke the all-time record for farthest distance any human had traveled from Earth, 252,760 miles. They watched a solar eclipse from behind the moon. They cried on live television. They named a lunar crater after Wiseman's late wife, Carol, who had died of cancer in 2020 while raising their 2 daughters, and had told her husband not to quit NASA. "Don't give this up for me," she had said. He didn't. And on the evening of April 10th, he and his crew pointed the nose of Orion toward home, fired the thrusters to align the heat shield with the planet below, and fell toward the atmosphere at nearly 35 times the speed of sound. Now we get to the 6 minutes. At 7:53 in the evening, Eastern Time, Orion crossed 400,000 feet. Entry interface. The atmosphere, barely a whisker at that altitude, began to bite. Within seconds, the air compressing against the heat shield superheated into plasma. A sheath of ionized gas surrounded the capsule, glowing at nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, half the temperature of the surface of the sun. And that plasma did something beyond just burning. It blocked every radio signal, every transmission, every call for help. Communications went dead. At Mission Control in Houston, Flight Director Jeff Radigan and his entire team sat in silence, staring at screens showing nothing, listening to speakers playing nothing. The most capable aerospace engineers on the planet, completely powerless, waiting. Inside the capsule, the 4 crew members felt nearly 4 times their body weight pressing them into their seats. At that level of G-force, breathing becomes a deliberate act. You have to consciously force air into your lungs against the pressure trying to collapse your chest. Your arms weigh 40 pounds each. Your vision narrows to a tunnel. The capsule is not shaking gently. The entire vehicle is vibrating as superheated air batters it from every direction. And through the windows, this is what nobody fully prepares you for. You see nothing but fire. Not a glimpse of Earth, not a star, not sky, just a solid wall of white and orange plasma that makes the windows look like they are actively melting around you. The entire visible universe from inside that capsule is flame. For 4 minutes of that, the heat shield was under maximum stress. The Avcot material was either charring evenly the way the engineers had promised, or it was sealing, building pressure, cracking, and preparing to blow off in fragments the way it had done before. There was no instrument inside that capsule that could tell them which one was happening. There was no abort, no escape system, no backup shield, no eject button. You cannot build redundancy into a heat shield. It either works or it doesn't. And in that moment, falling through fire at the center of a plasma ball that blocked every signal, the 4 crew members of Artemis 2 simply had to sit there and wait to find out which one it was. Reed Wiseman, who had raised 2 daughters alone after losing his wife to cancer, who had promised those girls he was coming home, who had flown 300,000 miles to name a crater after their mother. He sat in that burning machine with no radio and no options and counted the seconds. Then, just before 8 o'clock, the plasma cleared. A voice came through the static. Calm, steady, almost casual. "Houston, integrity. We have you loud and clear." The shield had held. The modified trajectory had worked. The continuous heating had kept the outer layer permeable. The gases had vented. The char had eroded slowly and evenly, exactly as it was supposed to. Without cracking, without fracturing, without blowing pieces of itself into the hypersonic slipstream. 2.5 years of testing, over 100 experiments, 200 material samples, and the engineers had gotten it right. At 8:07 that evening, Orion hit the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. Recovery divers climbed in through the hatch. All 4 astronauts, healthy, good shape, already making jokes. Somewhere on the surface of the moon right now, there is a bright little crater with no official designation yet. The crew calls it Carol. Depending on where you are and what phase the lunar cycle is in, you can see it from your backyard with the right equipment. A small, bright spot on the boundary between the side of the moon we know and the side we are only beginning to explore. 4 people rode a controlled fireball through 6 minutes of silence. 4 minutes of maximum heat and a heat shield everybody agreed was imperfect. Some called it calculated risk. Some called it reckless. The crew called their capsule integrity, and they flew it anyway. If this one got you, share it with someone who still thinks space is routine. It isn't. It never was. See you in the next one.